So Sandra gave a great introduction, and I want to add some meat around the bones to her discussion now, talking about some daunting challenges in food security and the environment, and I want to talk about some broad concepts as well as get down to some nitty-gritty so we actually see what the problems are. And I renamed this talk, since I initially spoke with Sandra, on expanding the boundaries of agricultural development. How do we need to be thinking differently? What are the new areas we need to be thinking about to solve some of the really, really tough problems? And if we look today relative to, say, 25 years ago, when a lot of agricultural development programs were getting started at universities or were sort of in the stage of being further developed, or look 35 years ago, there's a lot of things that are really, really different today. You know, population, we have 2 billion more people on the planet, and that's going to continue to go up. Income per capita is going up very rapidly in some areas, stagnating in others. Higher meat consumption per capita, obviously much higher energy demand per capita. We have the establishment now of the biofuels industry. Even though 25 years ago we were toying around with this, now it's really an industry that is viable and has taken a sort of a global hold right now. Global capital flows. I'm going to talk about just what all this flow of money and assets means for our field right now. Obviously a huge expansion in global trade. Much more controversy over future crop technologies. I think there was greater faith that these technologies were going to carry us through, and now it's the question, will they carry us through? And what about GMOs? Do we like them? Do we not? What about advanced genetics? All these issues are on the table. There's a much more scientific consensus now on climate change, and that's going to be a big issue for us. Obviously more pressure on water resources, much more of a focus, like Sandra said, on ecosystem services, which is a good thing. Much more focus on food. What are we eating? You know, a lot of foodie kind of conferences and a lot of focus, which I think is fantastic, and I think it provides us with a great platform right now. So anyway, we're really looking at a different world. And so the whole point that I want to make today is, in this very vastly changing world, how do we expand the boundaries of our thinking and deal with some of the real intractable problems? So again, what are the goals we're even looking at? You know, and the goals, I think, are to improve food security. So agriculture is not just about agriculture itself. It's about providing food. It's providing incomes and other ecosystem services. And so improving food security through improving rural incomes, crop productivity, natural resource and environmental management, having a greater focus on nutrition, and then improving the avenues for innovation, technology, institutions, and in farming systems. You know, how do we actually get a grasp on these? So these, to me, are the goals of where we are really trying to head. But when we look at the recent, experience on where we are in global food security, and I'm sorry, this would have been bigger if I had the full PowerPoint, but what we're looking at here is 2004 to 2006 in the first column, and then 2009. And the point that I'm making here, after the big food crisis and the economic collapse globally, we now have over 1 billion people in a chronically malnourished state. That's improved a little bit this past year. But I think reaching the billion mark again is sort of symbolic, just in the magnitude of the problem we're dealing with, and in the challenges it presents for how do we as a community get at this. I think that we've been working hard at it, but we haven't really been as successful as we would have liked. And we focus a lot on sub-Saharan Africa, but it's important to note Asia has the most malnourished people. So I decided to take this theme of expanding the boundaries because we're expanding the boundaries of this whole realm of what we're dealing with now. And that was the first slide I showed you. You know, we're dealing with a new set of issues here. But we also need to be expanding the boundaries of our thinking and our knowledge and how we train our students. And so that's the theme I want to take today. And I've got 5 topics. I'm going to talk about 3 of them in somewhat in depth and just really touch on 2 of them. But if I thought about the first one, it's expanding now all these linkages, new linkages in agricultural development. We now have a new set of energy agriculture linkages, finance agriculture linkages that are real, that are changing what we see and how markets operate today. And in my view, to put my bottom line up front, we need much greater focus in our field on macroeconomics. Many of our students aren't even trained in macroeconomics in many of the programs. And without understanding some of the macroeconomic dimensions of this, I think we're going to fall short in being able to handle some of these problems. And so let me just go through a few slides. What I have on this slide is real commodity prices. This is a slide many of you have seen. I'm translating for the people in the back of the room, because I'm sure it's hard to see. But going from 1970 to 2010 here. And it's for red is rice, green is wheat, blue is maize, and the black one here is petroleum. And I think what you'll see, a couple of things to pick up from this slide is that for a long time we had real declining prices of these commodities. And then more recently, those trends have gone up. And there's a big debate as to whether we're going to continue to have real price declines in the future, or are we seeing a transition towards real price increases? That's going to have a major impact on how poor people actually can afford food. But the other thing you'll notice just from the slide, lots of variability. So the variability around those trends is terribly important for poor people and their access to food. And then we have these major price spikes. We had a major one in 72, 73, and then more recently. How does the policy community actually deal with price spikes, and why are they important, and what does it mean? Because they have a real impact, particularly if you're spending 70% of your household budget on food and you have these price spikes. Obviously, the agriculture and energy linkages in this recent period are very tight, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more and why now when the biofuels thing started, I have to admit, as an agricultural economist, the agriculture and food world is so big and complicated on its own. And then to say, now you got to learn all about the energy markets is really daunting. I mean, the energy markets are hugely complicated. But here we have it, because even if we think that biofuels is not as big of an issue as it was in 2007, 2008, it's still increasing here in the United States. 35% of our corn crop is going to ethanol right now. And this is the red line that you just see there. A lot of it is driven off our mandates and policies. As many of you know, we just increased the mandate for blending from E10 to E15, which is going to be phased in for the next few years, which sort of opens up a bottleneck that we had on our use, on our demand side. But mandates are driven also by, subsidies for blenders, subsidies for corn producers, obviously, and a number of trade, tariff protection, ad valorem taxes, and so forth. So the policy set is driving this as well, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. Places like the Philippines down here has mandates on its renewable fuels, China, and so forth. So in China, if you think about, one of the SUVs sitting in the line there, a lot of people refer to the comparison that to fill up one tank in your SUV of corn-based ethanol takes enough corn to feed a person for a whole year in a place like sub-Saharan Africa. And so that food-feed trade-off, I think, is really important, but it is driving a very tight linkage. And this is just the correlations between, we've always had very tight correlations between crude and gasoline. I'm comparing 1988 to 2005 and then 2006 to 2009. Crude gasoline's always been correlated about 0.9, very tightly coupled. But in the past, the petroleum and corn prices have not been really coupled at all. And in this recent period, the correlation is 0.8. And so now we're seeing petroleum setting a reference price for biofuel use and so forth, and we're seeing these fields moving together in very, very important ways. So I think we really do need to expand the boundaries of thinking of energy markets. And it's not just energy markets. This is, it's hard for you to see from the back, but this is a correlation matrix from a recent paper I wrote with Wally Falcon that's coming out later this year, looking at this whole set of macro prices. And it's essentially looking at the correlations between wheat, maize, petroleum, and then exchange rates. Either you use the US dollar to euro or the NIR, which is trade-weighted exchange rate. And you see very, very high correlations among all of these variables. And so the question is it energy prices driving maize prices? Is it the real exchange rate? Because as we've had depreciation of our exchange rate, anything denominated in US dollars is going to increase in price. And so Did we see that spike because our economy was, in such a state that we were having a depreciating exchange rate, or because of the energy issue? How are those two things linked? So it's a much more complicated situation right now. And on the exchange rate issue, for example, there is so much international asset flows going on. I mean, 2 weeks ago, one of our friends who runs a hedge fund said $4 trillion in foreign exchange currency was traded in one day. I mean, this is huge movements of currency around the world. And so it really does actually impact the prices that we see on the international markets. And it makes a difference. I have the role of exchange rates here, where I track the U.S. Corn denominated in U.S. dollars. And you can see during this depreciating period for the U.S. dollar, corn prices were going up. They were also going up because of energy demand and a whole host of other demands, and then some supply issues. But then after the economic crash, both the demand side went down and the dollar actually started appreciating against the euro. And you saw this coming down. Well, when you look in other countries, so I've got Guatemala maize and Kenya maize here, essentially after the economic collapse, their prices didn't go down just in the sheer, denomination in U.S. dollar, because they were appreciating during, relative to the dollar at this time. And so before you even get into policies, the exchange rates do make a difference in terms of what prices countries see.
So the corn price has really gone up recently.
Yes.
So is that unusual with regard to this pattern? Are we going into something unusual?
I think I'd like to take that up later. I mean, this is related to a number of expectations, but you're right on track with this. This question this point that I'm about to make is these agricultural finance linkages. When we thought about the 2008 bubble, a lot of people blamed hedge funds or speculative traders and so forth. Actually, a lot of the futures trading was done by the commercial traders, that normally trade in futures to stabilize prices. But there was a lot of flurries of speculative activity and a lot of expectations that were built into this market that I think really accentuated that bubble. And expectations, whether they're right expectations or wrong expectations, may be more important than structural features in terms of driving things. So now that we have these actors in here, this is important. To get to your point about the corn price now, the USDA had announced a certain stock level that we had in corn, which was overestimated, and the stock level is coming out to be much lower than that, as is some of the production. And so there was an expectation on a price that now the expectations are all readjusting. And it's going to be interesting to see whether that turns into a big bubble, whether it stays high or not. So we're still in the wait to see mode. But from my perspective, if we're talking about the goal of food security, it's like this is an issue and it's changing everything in the world, but how does it actually get down to the things we care about, which is or that I care about in this talk, which is food security for the poor? Does it translate down into these markets? And how do we know? I think in the last bubble there was a lot of talk of, well, high prices help net producers and hurt net consumers. And that's all we could really say. And actually, when you look at the data, most data is just by average across countries, and so it's really hard to see what's happening in the country. So we've taken the LSMS, the Living Standard Measurement Survey from the World Bank, and started getting down to the bottom decile or quintile of people. What are they buying and selling and so forth, and what difference does it make? And you have to get down to that level to be able to actually see. So I'm just going to tell you some of the, and I'll just read this quickly, some of the results from this this analysis of looking down at the poor and how might they be affected. And some of the surprising things we found was that net producers actually largely fall into the extremely poor groups. They tend to be poorer than net consumers, and they have less diversified income. And so it's interesting that net producers are in that low-income group, and that many in those low-income groups are net calorie deficit, about 10 to 20%. They're actually selling off their grain. They're sometimes buying more expensive food like sugar and meat and fish. That does give them a hedge to go back to their own crops during a price spike. But they do tend to be diversified. They're selling at least 4 crops and sometimes many more. So there's the diversification aspect is an important aspect for resilience here. But our conclusion is this generalization that high prices help producers and hurt consumers is true, but unhelpful in many of these places like sub-Saharan Africa, where so many people are kind of working at this very thin margin and are not clearly in any camp. And so sorting this question out, actually MSU has done some great work on this. Duncan Bowden is somewhere in the audience, and Tom Jane and others, and in their surveys in Africa, 1 to 4% of maize farmers are actually accounting for 50% or more of the market. They're helped when prices go high. They're helped when you have stable prices. But the vast majority, 50, 70%, are in this consumption range or trade thinning where they can really be hurt by price spikes. And so it's interesting to see how we can go from macro all the way down to the micro, and I think that's where we need to expand our thinking. That's sort of my first point here. So the second expansion of boundaries is on climate change. I mean, we are entering a completely different world. This was also in the 2008 bubble. Australia suffered a major drought, and this was adding to some of the price pressures at that time. And most people think about drought as the big problem in climate change. They're not necessarily thinking about heat. And actually, precipitation and rainfall is much more controversial in the climate models. There's much less agreement among models as to what is actually going to happen to precipitation. So there's much more agreement on what's going to happen to heat. It is going to get warmer, and I'm going to focus on heat in these comments. And so when we look at global climate change, the question is, are we going out of bounds? Are we entering a new world? And this is, we don't have to look way into the future to get kind of a sense of what's happening here. This is the Russian heat wave this summer in the wheat growing areas of Russia where they had the heat and the fires and so forth. And I work a lot with David Battisti at the University of Washington, and he did this graph for me, which essentially is looking at, take the past 100 years from 1900 to 2006, and what has been happening in terms of the mean growing season temperature here around 0. And there's been cold years, there's been warm years during that 100 years. And the warmest years have gone up to about 2.7 degrees Celsius above normal. Well, what we saw this summer is almost 5 degrees Celsius above that mean. And so we're way out of bounds in terms of this. And as we know, Russia banned its wheat exports for actually over a year, and it's threw a lot of the markets into somewhat of turmoil here. And so a lot of analyses of this says, okay, if we're looking at the future, if we think about a temperature distribution where you, in the past 100 years, where you had some mean temperature here, you had some cold years, you had some warm years, when you look at the next 100 years, the end of the next century, is in fact the hottest years we see now, or that we've seen in the past 100 years, is that going to be, in fact, the mean that we see in the future? And that's a pretty daunting question to ask. And if you just look at the projections of the Russian situation, the exact same growing season area that we've talked about, in fact, the mean is right around where that huge anomaly was in the future, and so that will be the mean. Now, it's important to note the tails, because some of these models, this is taking 23 models from the IPCC and taking all the results, so you're getting the range of uncertainty that all the models see and the range of projections, okay? And uncertainty should be the prime word here as we're talking about these kind of wicked problems. But some of the tails take you up to 10 degrees Celsius above where we have been in the past 100 years. So this is a really extreme situation. And this is the situation that I've shown. And of course, for agriculture, it makes a difference because you have temperature stress on the physiological process of the crop. You have temperature-related moisture stress. You're losing some of the crop genetic diversity that you want to save for future breeding. And so the question is this accurate, or in the future, in fact, is the distribution going to be completely out of bounds of what we have seen in the past 100 years? And you can do this for different regions. And this is our projections for the Sahel area, which is just completely out of bounds. Okay, the coldest year in the future is going to be still warmer than any of the warmest that they've seen in the past. And we published this in Science about a year ago. you can go into any country, actually in Africa, and get virtually the same exact shape and result of this. And so really we are going out of bounds. And if you think about this sort of situation, think of the color orange and red. That means that almost with 100% certainty, because you're taking all the uncertainty of all of the different models that are projecting here. Okay, it's not just one model in one location, it's all of the scientific information we have. So think about red and orange being close to 100% certainty. Even by the middle of the century, we're going to have pockets, particularly in the tropics and subtropics, that are almost certainly already going to be out of range of what we've seen in the past 100 years. And these are based on the climate models. When you look to the end of the century, it's just a completely different sphere. Okay? So again, out of bounds, and how are we as a community going to try to prepare for both the uncertainty and the likely outcomes of this? And so there is a lot of attention on the adaptation field, and because this is small, I'll give you the keynotes here, that there's two camps on how we think about adaptation. And if you look at the climate change community in the IPCC, they're looking at adaptation as adapting to a projected or expected change that we see based on all the scientific information. So if you see those really hot years in the crop growing season, how are we going to adjust by choosing new crops, by breeding for heat tolerance, for alleviating water stress and so forth. The World Bank, on the other hand, is saying, let's just increase the resilience of these systems by investing in sort of the welfare of farmers like we've always been doing. If we invest in fertilizers, invest in good seed markets and seed technology, get markets going and so forth, they are going to be more resilient and are going to be able to deal with this. So it's sort of taking the existing development model and saying that's going to provide the resilience, not that we should divert any money from what we're doing now and put it into new breeding efforts or something like that. So this is a big controversy. And how are we actually, we got scarce resources, so how are we actually going to solve this? And so, I mean, one observation I would have is that despite the kind of efforts we've had in investing in agricultural systems and people, it hasn't been overwhelmingly successful by the data I showed before. And so really the attention level and focus has got to be changed. There's a lot of adaptation ideas of, this is breeding for drought stress, which has been done in Mexico and particularly in Kenya through SMEP. But can we invest in heat tolerance stress? How do we think about preserving genetic diversity so we have seeds that can be used for breeding in the future? People say agriculture is going to move to temperate areas. Well, it doesn't just move, it moves through a lot of breeding efforts. Do we have the genetic material we need that is going to infer that kind of heat tolerance? And so efforts to collect land races, crop wild relatives, and so forth. And then there's also technological solutions, which I'm going to get to in a minute. So what is the range of adaptation? And I think I'll just conclude this section with saying, we got a world with scarce resources. So I think when we're looking at the projections of all the scientific knowledge that's out there just on one aspect, which is heat, these marginal kind of changes are not going to be sufficient. And this is just a cartoon, really, showing the probability of expected returns to adaptation. If we're thinking, well, maybe we won't have that many returns because we don't really know with 100% certainty that everything is right, so let's not invest in this, as opposed to just huge returns that we would have foregone if we had, invested. So I think we need to, as a community, have this discussion and figure out what are we willing to spend. It's going to be costly, okay? So, and there's going to be trade-offs. So where do we want to go with this? So the third area, and this is the last one I'll develop fully, is expanding the physical boundaries of agriculture. This is in Brazil, where soybeans are encroaching on the forests. And I want to just raise, we've had issues for quite a long time of cattle going into forests and livestock and so forth. And there's really good papers and really good discussion we can have on trying to move towards less land-intensive meat options. Chickens, poultry, other things besides cattle. It has to be in the rainforest, for example. But I'm going to deal with a more important point, which is, are we running out of steam with our cultivars? For the past 40 years or so, the mantra has been intensification, we'll save land for nature, we get virtually all of our production gains off of yields, and we don't have to move into area. And is that true, or are we starting to see some fundamental change? Are we running out of the ability to actually do that? And I always show my students the pile of grain picture, which is just, this is grain production going from 1960 to 2009, and as all of you know, we've had 2 to 3 fold increase in grain production. This is area. It's virtually not been changing very much. And you have in the dark line production and yields here in the dotted line. And it's been tracking almost over 90% of the production gains has been from yields. But in this last period, you're starting to see a gap coming in here. And this is just for grains. But is this gap serious, or is this just like going to go like this, or can we close the gap, or is it serious? So I want to focus on what we have seen with area expansion and yield. The World Bank, I don't know if you've seen this report they had on land grabs and land expansion recently. It's a pretty interesting report, but they're looking at how much since 1990 to 2007 has been gained in production from yield versus area. In sub-Saharan Africa, majority is coming from area. South America, mostly yields, but some from area. Southeast Asia, you have a pretty big area component here. And then the others, East Asia is losing area, population density. South America is almost all yields. And so, so how do we actually interpret these kind of trends? When we look, for example, of soybean expansion, there you can get more area by substituting, crops, growing soybeans now in areas that used to be something else. And, or you can go into what we call the Ricardian margin, starting to expand into other areas. And this would be how I would sort of explain the soybean expansion in Brazil, going up into the Amazon, into Mato Grosso now, which is the picture on the right-hand side. And it's really interesting to actually start disentangling area from yield. US soybeans from 80 to 94, actually area declined, and it was all due to yields. But 1995 to 2009, 44% of the increase was due to area. This was some crop substitution. It was pretty low production growth, actually, only about 0.4% per annum. In Brazil, though, 1986 to 94, 29% due to area. 1995 to 2009, 81% due to area. And they have a very high growth rate of 3.1% per year on soy. I mean, they're taking over the soy markets. And so are we now transforming this intensification to an intensification model? Indonesia is the other major country that's going through this, particularly with its oil palm, which is a cooking oil as well as potential commercial biofuel. And the soy is obviously a livestock feed, but also potential biodiesel. And they have been transforming their rainforests at a very rapid rate. This is oil palm here in a native forest, a mature oil palm. And at great expense to their ecosystems and species, like orangutans are the sort of capstone species that keeps getting focused on. They have a nursery for these little orphan orangutans that are, just getting straight. So it's really having a large impact. And when you look at palm oil growth, how much is achieved via area expansion? For the world, 1995 to 2009, 68% of it is coming from area. In Africa, World Bank just took money out of Nigeria where they invested in oil palm. 86% is coming from area. But most of the production of this is in Asia. Indonesia is the largest producer after Malaysia, accounting for a vast majority of production. And here it was 99% out of area, and now 92% out of area. And so some of these major oilseed crops, I mean, it's becoming a very important deal in terms of the expansion. So this ecosystem service versus food versus fuel, these are all major issues. Now, Indonesia has some other issues going on here. And this is a picture of clearing in the area of West Papua. A lot of companies are getting concessions to grow oil palm now, and for hundreds of thousands of hectares. And they're deforesting, and they're getting the timber revenue, which is actually illegal timber revenue, and never planting. So is this a timber issue, or, it's a complicated issue. It's not all that clear cut. And they're getting concessions to grow in places like this that really aren't good for agriculture. Actually, this is terrible for oil palm because oil palm can grow almost anywhere, but not really in wet locations. So there's profits to be made, there's corruption, there's a political economy story here, there's forestry. If we go into the wicked mode, we're getting there quickly with oil palm in Indonesia. And while I was there in August in West Papua, a new project was announced, the Feed the World project in West Papua. This is the location of it. Not exactly set up to feed the world. 5 major companies, 5 of the largest companies in Indonesia, all of which have large oil palm interests, are behind this. They got 1.6 million hectares to develop all sorts of kinds of food. This is not the right location. There's no labor, there's no infrastructure. You know, my expectation is looking 3 or 4 years from now, lots of deforestation and hardly any food being grown there is what I would expect. Now, these kind of land speculation, land grab kind of ideas are happening at the domestic level. In some cases, and I just really want to make a note on oil palm, that where oil palm is being produced, a lot of smallholders are also in that game. They're getting a lot of returns. It is a development mechanism in a lot of cases, so it's a complicated issue. But the land grab thing is more complicated, and this report by the World Bank, you know, is just really highlights this now. In the past year, 2008 to 2009, 42 million hectares were bought up in developing countries. If you look at the previous decade prior to that, the average was about 4 million hectares per year, so it's a 10-fold increase. And why is this happening? I mean, the returns to financial assets in that asset market I was talking about a minute ago, there's really hard to make returns, and you see a lot of companies and a lot of countries going into land now. Land is returning a high value, and so countries like China or Saudi Arabia are trying to secure future food, but companies, and I have talked to a few different hedge funds managers who actually the asset management companies are going into this now too, buying up land with the intention of selling it fairly quickly. And there was one, for example, that I know fairly well going into Paraguay and Zimbabwe of all places, anywhere where land titles are not that clear. Okay, so this is the main theme I'm trying to set up now, is a focus on land titles, land institutions. What do we know? This is all, 75% of these land sales are in sub-Saharan Africa, where land titles are really murky. Indonesia, all those land titles are very murky. Same with Brazil. Land titling is very, very murky. And so the hedge fund we were talking to is going in, they're expecting to sell out in 3 to 6 months to Soros, who's going to put it on the commercial stock exchange, to the Chicago Stock Exchange. So actually, I ran into somebody, this is embarrassing to say, from the Stanford Endowment in the drugstore a couple of weeks ago, and he said, Raz, I need to talk to you because I was just in Brazil. You know, I said, what were you doing in Brazil? Well, we're looking at buying land. And I said, for what? And he said, for the endowment. I said, no, you're not allowed to do that. You know, does not sound sustainable. He goes, well, I want to talk to you about that. I think it is sustainable, and it's the right people, and the local communities are involved. And so now link the beginning part of my talk with where we're heading. This is going to be really interesting to see where this goes, I think. And it's really expanding the boundaries. This is a chart from that area, and I'll just summarize to say that in some countries like Rwanda and Malawi, most of the arable land is used for agriculture. But in places like Zimbabwe, well, Sudan, Zambia, Mozambique, Madagascar, you guys have projects in some of these areas, you know, 25% or less of the available land is actually used for agriculture now. So it's a right place to buy up. And I know Tom, Jane, and Duncan and others are worried about this issue to some extent. In Latin America, same thing when you go down to the bottom. Brazil, they say, you know, 60% of the land area. They've got a big rainforest they could use if they wanted to. So this is a big trade-off. Argentina is at about 50%, Uruguay at about 20% of available land areas used for agriculture so far. So a lot of potential investments in these areas. And so is this a pathway out of poverty? I mean, actually, when you look at the results of these land deals and land speculation, how much has it benefited? This is people growing jatropha, so forth. The returns have been much less than expected. So I'm just going to now touch on 2 points really quickly, and then I'll end. The fourth boundary issue is on this boundary of innovation. How do we get at this issue of persistent poverty? It's probably not through these land speculation deals, but how do we think differently? I mean, we've been thinking about this as a community for quite some time, and should we be thinking fundamentally differently? Now, especially with all the Gates funding that's involved and so forth, there is an opportunity to think through this now. And I want to just mention two things. Expanding into thinking much more about diversification of the crop base. I think after the Green Revolution, we did focus a lot on rice, wheat, corn. You know, and these are crops that have been enormously successful in some areas. But in those areas where it's really intractable poverty, those crops yield really little yields. There's no fertilizer there, mostly because people can't afford it and they don't have access to it. There's 90% or more is rain-fed. And so these are tough areas. And so what can focus more on crop diversification? How do we get that? What does it do for you? I mean, there's certainly a nutritional aspect to this. And nutrition's got to expand into the micronutrients and other things as well. I personally don't think all micronutrient work should be done through biofortification of you know, sort of breeding crops to have more zinc or so forth. Why not just grow more crops that are zinc intensive and get some of the other benefits? Also, the elastic demand in markets, you know, and I'm going to talk about this actually in the afternoon breakout session, but these have much more elastic demand, much more robust demand when you bring them to market. Obviously improve soil fertility. Pest pathogen, that's striga on the right, and striga tends to be much less of a problem when you have a more diverse system than just maize or just cowpeas or whatever. And for climate, you know, what is going to be more resilient? What crops are going to be more resilient to climate? And so this is the afternoon session. I'm putting a plug to come have a discussion with me. You know, this is one technology that we've been really working on, is using the sun, which is going to be very intensive, to be able to get the pull on some very widely distributed water systems to irrigate high-value crops in a more large cooperative system. And we've found huge success, and I want to tell you about that, that technology innovation. But I think, and have a discussion of how difficult some of the dimensions are, but the points I want to make are that poor people maybe don't want just poor crops, and poor people maybe don't want just really poor technology that breaks down right away. And markets are functioning different with cell phone and so forth. So how do we take advantage of this in the future? And the last little expansion, you know, I want to think kind of broadly, like get out of the bounds that we're in. The boundaries between nutrition and infectious disease. You know, Gates has this huge program on infectious disease and disease more generally, and then this has a huge agricultural program. Those two programs do not talk to each other at all. And you see this in governments, you see this all over the place. And this is a picture of North Korea, and we're developing a study to actually just look at when you can take a really good example of this was the famine in 1990s caused by the Soviet separation from North Korea, the obviously very close government there, poor land management and huge floods, and you know, they just had a massive drought. I know you guys all, I mean, a massive famine, and I know all of you know about this, but you know, 1992, the government announced, let's have 2 meals a day program. And you know, that had huge, serious effect for a whole cohort of people. And now you can take that cohort of people and say, how have they fared with their resistance to disease? It's actually kind of a unique study, but it's just one example. And when you look at North Korea, they have a population of 20, and would take infectious tuberculosis, 24 million people in the country, 8 to 10 have latent TB in this country. And the rates of acquiring active TB and then spreading it are very rapid, mostly resistant strains of TB, drug-resistant strains. So it's a massive problem. 10% resurgence in recovered patients, and each patient, you know, infects 20 people. So this is a huge problem because they're all, you know, a lot of drug-resistant strains. And the big issue is, will this jump into China? And with a lot of drug-resistant strains of tuberculosis, just, you know, have this big global effect. And so we're looking at, TB is one. AIDS, you can think of the same thing. If you're malnourished, can you actually deal with the drug interventions that are available to you? What is your vulnerability? I mean, the basic point is that your immune system shuts down or is highly suppressed during periods of malnutrition. So making those links. So I'll end with just trying to get us to think bigger. And I've talked about macroeconomics. For me right now, I will learn more about what's happening in agricultural markets by calling a hedge fund trader or an energy analyst than talking to a number of people in my field. I mean, these guys are on all the prices, all the movements. They have all this data I don't even have access to at the sort of global international scale. And they want information from us, people that are more on the ground. So, but I always tell my students, when you go to the field and you start doing policy advising, which is what I'm really interested in, it's going to be much more effective to talk to the finance minister than to talk to the agricultural minister in almost all cases in terms of getting something done. So I want to put that on the scale of moving into, obviously, taking on climate change, figuring out which path of adaptation is good or likely. Land institutions, there's a whole history of land institution studies and so forth. Wisconsin has had a very good reputation in this, but I don't think it's current to the political economy issues that are out there right now. And I think we really need to rejuvenate that field. That's probably going to call for expertise from sociology, legal expertise, a lot of different fields, and a lot of people, different people who are actually on the ground dealing with this. Thinking about new innovations and health. So I'll just conclude with 4 points. These are all really tough problems. Sandra might think they're tame. No, they're obviously not exactly in the tame range, and most analysts and institutions lack the ability to deal with these complex, very multidimensional, multidisciplinary kinds of problems. And when I think about interdisciplinary versus multidisciplinary, we have a Ph.D. program at Stanford training students in interdisciplinary training and environment and resources. And I would say I'm a little bit frustrated with that program. I mean, we get unbelievably good students. We take 5 out of an applicant pool of 150 every year from all over the world. They're great students. But it's really hard as PhD training to get them. They get a lot of breadth, but how do they get the depth that they really need to solve some of these problems? And this is really challenging. Like, I look at some of the MSU programs you're running students through on a very depth kind of oriented track in agricultural development, and they may not have all this other stuff I'm talking about, but they've got the tools on the ground. So somehow bridging these, and my view on this is that some people are really good at the interdisciplinary, have the training, sometimes they come in with a master's in one thing and go into PhD in another, and can be leaders in that. Not everybody should be interdisciplinary. Maybe some people with that kind of glue, and then other people who are more disciplinary focused, willing to join these kind of multidisciplinary teams, I think is, and who are really interested in doing that, but maintaining their expertise in the process, I think is really important. Obviously, as we expand this realm and expand the boundaries, we're definitely getting increased relevance, but are we losing focus in the process? And so Sandra mentioned the objectives and how we balance the objectives, and I think this is really hard. I mean, I love win-win solutions, but and you can find a lot of them at kind of local and regional scales. When you get into the policy domain, I think it's really hard to get win-win solutions. There's almost always some big trade-off that you have to deal with, and then you are going to have to prioritize ecosystem services versus the development of these smallholder oil palm producers or whatever, so it's a tough issue. And then the final one is, I think the urgency really remains on solving and getting at this problem. So it's not one we have the leisure to figure out in the next couple of decades. I mean, I really think we need to change things now and to feed the world and do so in a more sustainable way. It's a good time. People are really focused on food right now. I mean, to have a food conference, hundreds of people from the community and so forth will show up. I've been to all these different, some are interested just, can I buy my food from the local market, which is a great goal because it's supporting local farmers and so forth. And then some are really, well, what, they start learning about other things. I think the focus on food now is the right time to really get this on a policy agenda. But my view, and Sandra mentioned it too, is how to bridge academics, NGOs, private sector, public sector in our efforts here. I'll give you one quick example. In the rainforest issue in Brazil, Cargill is the main purchaser and shipper of the soybeans there, but they have now, for public appearance reasons and their own philosophy, have worked with TNC, Nature Conservancy, to just buy certified soybeans on land that's not expanding, that's obeying the legal boundaries of how much rainforest has to be left and so forth. And so you see, you know, if you're going to set up environment versus corporations, for example, we're sunk, you know, because we're going to need the corporations in these kind of in these kind of cooperative deals where they're seeing the benefit of this as well. So I will leave it with there, and we'll have more time. Sorry about the hold up in the beginning, but we can have discussion later.